Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session on the Merit Shine channel, and we are looking at another interesting session today, and we're carrying on from where we left off in the session wherein we talked about banking awareness, but we looked at the report card of the previous year wherein we talked about the economic survey. But today is basically presenting you a world of opportunities, which is the union budget for the coming financial year, that is 2022-2023. So Nirmala ji was gracious enough in the budget, and she has presented an awesome growth budget in the sense that we're talking at India at 75 this year, right? And she's basically talked about India at 100 for the next 25 years, and is basically referred to as the Amrit Kal. So if you look at this particular budget, it basically talks about essentially growth opportunities, massive inflows in terms of infrastructure, and a huge impetus on a lot of growth related elements. But if you belong to that category which basically thinks कि instant gratification, abhi immediately क्या मिलेगा, so you would be slightly disappointed on that front, because essentially the tax slabs remain the same, not much variation on that perspective. Obviously, there were definite advantages that in case if you want to file your revised returns, then you get an additional period of 2 years that is there from the year of the actual assessment. So all those things are there, but very minor things from that perspective, but nothing specifically to excite you about from the perspective of a common man. But this was essentially driven as a growth budget, and of course there were definitely a lot of impetus on startups, a lot of impetus on the banking elements as well. We'll talk about the post offices and the integration of that into the core banking solution. A lot of those things have actually come about in this year's budget, and a lot of interesting things in store for today's session. So what are we waiting for? Let's jump right in. Right, so before we get into the nitty-gritties, let's first of all try and understand कि when you talk about a budget, right, it's about obviously what are the receipts, what is the money coming in, what is the money going out. So let us try and understand first of all कि पैसा from an India perspective, where is the money actually coming from? Where is it coming from? So firstly, you're looking at the receipts overall, right? And from that perspective, I look at basically first element, it's the borrowings and the liability. So that is the first major chunk from where the money is basically coming in. Then you talk about the GST revenues, again a significant chunk from there as well. Then you have the corporation tax, which basically is at, again 15%, and the income tax is at basically 15%, and obviously small portions coming from your union excise duties. And you talk about your customs, your non-tax revenues, and of course a small bit coming from your non-debt capital receipts as well. So this is where the money is coming in. Now the next question that comes is कि भाई खर्चा कहाँ पे हो रहा है? Where is the money actually going out? So the first thing is, because you had a major chunk, that is 35%, which of which was basically the borrowings, obviously the maximum amount of payments also will be in that context only, right? So the maximum amount of payment is basically in the context of your interest payments. Then of course you have your state's share of your taxes and duties, जो भी उनको devolution में पैसा मिलता है, and that is how they will basically look at expending their state level expenditures on a capital expenditure perspective, infrastructure, and a lot of other angles also. Then couple of important things come into the picture, and ये इसलिए relevant है because a lot of exams are focusing on these days, right? So इसमें basically schemes की बात आती है, and there are two basic essential types of schemes. One is your central sector schemes, जहाँ पे the entire funding is basically from the center itself. That is why it's called a central sector scheme, complete funding from the center. And these are basically the schemes, and there will be several ministries that will basically operate under this, and the ministries and the departments, and उसमें कितना पैसा allocation होता है, all of that basically comes into this area, right? The second angle is basically the centrally sponsored schemes. Essentially what the center is saying on this front is that these are important schemes which are important from the country's perspective, and I would contribute some portion to this, but I expect you also to contribute a significant portion. That is what it is. And within this you have what is called as your core schemes, which are important, and then there is something called as core of the core, मतलब important के भी important schemes, right? So all of that is basically what is your centrally sponsored schemes. So when I look at the central sector schemes, that basically contributes 15% to the expenditure that you're talking about, and then your centrally sponsored schemes roughly boils down to around 9%, right? That is the overall context as far as the numbers are concerned. Now again, you have another chunk which is 17%, which basically goes to your finance commission and other kinds of transfers that are there. Then you're also giving subsidies, उसमें भी पैसा जा रहा है, right? That's roughly around 8%. Then again, defense expenditure is around 8%, then pension is around 4%, and there are other miscellaneous expenditures which are categorized as around 9%. So these are where the money is actually going out. And technically, when I say the money inflow is more than the money outflow, then it becomes a surplus situation. But in case the money outflow is more than the inflow, then what happens? Outflow ज़्यादा है तो deficit हो जाएगा, which is where the term fiscal deficit comes into the picture. And इस budget के हिसाब से भी, when you look at the fiscal deficit numbers, it's slightly on the higher side. So we'll discuss that in the subsequent slides. But when you look at the overall picture, the fiscal deficit should be a slightly lesser number. We are around 6.5% right now with this particular budget, which is definitely on the higher side, right? But the point is, we are recovering from a pandemic, right? And there is a lot of emphasis on expenditure from a growth perspective, right? So there is expenditure required, and we saw in the economic survey also, right? So if we are to become a $5 trillion economy by 2024, 2025, then of course you have to incur infrastructure related capital expenditure, which will be to the tune of $1.4 trillion. So from that perspective, expenditure incur करना भी जरूरी है for the growth of the economy, especially considering कि हम एक pandemic से बाहर निकल रहे हैं. We're coming out of a pandemic, so it's important for us to get out of it, right? So from that perspective, the fiscal deficit is acceptable is what many of the pundits are saying at this point of time. So now that we've understood the basic elements of where the expenditure is incurred and where is the revenue coming from, and this is a preliminary layman's understanding that I've given you, and of course we've derived the thought process as to why there is a fiscal deficit and why it is still acceptable to be above 6% right now, purely because of the fact that we are recovering from the pandemic. The thing that comes to the picture is कि अब let's talk about what exactly are the key things that are coming out from this budget. So first things first, right? So पहली चीज क्या आती है इसमें? We look at the growth, which is basically at a 9.27%, and obviously we are in a strong position, and we basically got that from the economic survey yesterday as well, and we are basically in a strong position to withstand any kind of challenges that are there, and obviously we are at a significantly higher vaccination levels, because of which the pandemic's impact in the third wave has also been slightly on the lower side, is what we've seen. Now next thing is that we've also seen that because of the productivity linked incentive scheme, or the PLI scheme that we had been talking about, basically 60 lakh new jobs have been created, and this is across 14 sectors, and that's a significant number overall, right? Now, talking specifically about the PLI schemes, it has also led to an increase or an additional production of rupees 30 lakh crores that has come through, and that is something which is again significant from a PLI perspective. Next thing हम बात करते हैं अमृत काल की, wherein we talked about India at 100. So अगले 25 साल में, for the next 25 years, what are the top 4 priorities that we are looking at? So the first thing that we're looking at is PM Gati Shakti, and we'll be discussing from this perspective, which is Gati and Shakti, the power of movement, right? So logistics ke perspective, that is what it's talking about, supply chain and all of that. Then its second element is basically talking about your inclusive development, as to how we can get the agri sector, the MSMEs, and all of them coming together and performing well. And the third thing we're talking about is how do you intend to finance all of these investments. The next thing is basically talking about the efficiency. So from the perspective of your productivity enhancement and your investments, you're talking about the sunrise opportunities in a lot of interesting sectors. You talk about artificial intelligence, geospatial satellites, you talk about the solar PV or the solar photovoltaic space itself altogether, energy transition, climate action, a lot of things that can be done from this perspective, right? So यहाँ पे बहुत कुछ है करने को, and the government is saying that let's try and bring in productivity in these elements as well. So these are the 4 key pillars as far as your Amrit Kal is concerned, and top 4 priorities basically, right? Now coming to the banking sector, which is the key thing for us. So इसमें क्या हो रहा है? पहली बात, first of all, the biggest thing that's being talked about is that we have a huge spread of the post offices across the country, and it is being said that all the 100% of the 1.5 lakh post offices, they are going to come under the core banking solution. So core banking solution essentially क्या कहता है कि मतलब अगर आप किसी भी लोकेशन में हैं, and if you basically have a bank account with one of the banks, then you can go and access that bank account across anywhere in the country, because the systems of that bank have been integrated so that आप कहीं से भी उस account को access करने की कोशिश करेंगे, any branch will be able to give you information about your account and will allow you to make withdrawals, transfers, whatever it is, right? That is what is core banking, bringing all the banking platform firstly from a single bank's perspective, so that anywhere you access that bank account, you'll be able to access that account, right? Anywhere in the country. The next element is within this core banking, obviously we've had many mergers and acquisitions happening, right? So obviously all of those banks, individual IT infrastructures also has to be brought together, and that is something which happened through the mergers and acquisitions that basically happened in the banking space. We talk about the amalgamations, right? And the next element is अभी इस leg में हम बोल रहे हैं कि post office को भी हम लेके आने वाले हैं. So all the post offices will be integrated to the core banking systems, and the idea will be that essentially you'll also be able to transfer or interact between the post office and the other banks directly. That's the context with which this is being brought down. So post offices will be integrated into the banking system. That is what this entire process is going to be all about. Next thing that comes is when you talk about the scheduled commercial banks as well. they are now expected to set up 75 digital banking units or DBUs, and that will be in 75 districts, right? So again, when you say digital banking units, this will obviously increase the financial inclusion angle and allow more active digital banking to happen across 75 districts that have been selected. That's the whole context from this perspective. And obviously, more inclusive financial inclusion also means that there'll be deeper penetration of the financial products into the country. That is the most important aspect. Now, moving on to the next thing, right? It also talks about a very interesting aspect, and we talked about the crypto wherein the economic survey kept quiet on it, but not today, right? So essentially there is going to be an introduction of a digital rupee by the Reserve Bank of India. So the finance minister said that the RBI will be introducing a digital rupee, and that will be in the 2022-2023 period, right? So this digital rupee is basically referring to your central bank digital currency that is going to come in, right? And of course there will be certain regulatory angles also creeping in. Now, another very important aspect that came out on the budget today was that any income, right, that is generated from the transfer of any virtual digital asset, right, essentially any kind of a digital currency that you're talking about. So any income from transfer of any virtual digital asset, that has to be basically taxed at the rate of 30%, right? इसमें कोई slabs नहीं है, सीधा 30% पे इसका taxing होगा. Any income that is generated from the transfer of a virtual digital asset. So this is the first level of regulation that is coming in from a digital assets perspective. Next thing, इसमें एक और चीज बोली गई है कि there will also be a discussion that a tax deducted at source of 1% could also be made applicable for, let's say, transactions which are above a particular threshold. कि अगर आप डिजिटल एसेट्स में डील कर रहे हो और उसमें कुछ इनकम जनरेशन का सिचुएशन है, जो भी है, एंड कोई ट्रांजैक्शन लेवल पे इज देयर इज अ चांस दैट द ट्रांजैक्शन वैल्यू एक्सीड्स अ पर्टिकुलर थ्रेशोल्ड लिमिट, देन ऑल्सो अ TDS of 1% would be applicable. बट इसमें अभी और क्लैरिटी आना है कि व्हाट विल बी दैट थ्रेशोल्ड, and a lot of those things obviously have to be brought in from a more clarity perspective. But these are the first steps of regulation that are coming in. So one, your digital rupee is going to come in from 2022-2023. That's a big news. And secondly, you're also looking at a 30% tax on the any income from the virtual digital assets that is there, and also a TDS of 1% depending on the threshold levels that the government and the RBI decide together, right? So that is from the banking perspective. Next thing that comes up is discussing the PM Gati Shakti itself. अब इसमें क्या हुआ है? There are basically 7 primary engines, right, that drives the entire Gati Shakti forward, right, this entire project forward. Which are the key 7 engines, right? So firstly, you're talking about the roads, you're talking about the railways, you're talking about the airports, you're talking about the ports, then you're talking about mass transport from one place to another, then you're talking about the waterways, and last but not the least, you're talking about the logistics infrastructure. So all these 7 put together are the basically lifeline, essentially, or the 7 engines that are driving the entire supply chain in the country. So इसमें क्या बोला गया है कि there will be a national master plan, right, and this will be for the economic transformation, for the seamless multimodal connectivity. When I say multimodal connectivity, one mode to another. So you talk about interconnectivity, आप rail से भी जा रहे हो, road से भी जा रहे हो, air से भी जा रहे हो. So there are multiple modes that you're using, right? And that is what is known as your multimodal connectivity, right? And you're also looking at the national master plan to bring in greater amount of logistics efficiency as well, right? So this is again massive from that perspective. Next thing, any of the projects that are related to these 7 engines, right? So इसमें हम किसी भी एलिमेंट की बात करें जो ये 7 इंजन से रिलेटेड हैं, कोई भी प्रोजेक्ट्स हैं जो कि अभी नेशनल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पाइपलाइन में हैं, राइट? एनी ऑफ दीज प्रोजेक्ट्स दैट आर देयर इन द नेशनल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पाइपलाइन ऑलरेडी, they will now be aligned with the PM Gati Shakti framework itself, right? So that is where the entire infrastructure alignment will happen. So anything that is there as a project in the national infrastructure pipeline regarding these 7 engines, right, that basically become a part of the PM Gati Shakti framework now. That is what it is being talked about. So it will be more actively monitored is what we're trying to tell you. नेक्स्ट थिंग, गुजरात में है भैया अपना इंटरनेशनल फाइनेंशियल सर्विस सेंटर. वी ऑलरेडी हैव दैट इन प्लेस. सो द गिफ्ट IFSC, इसमें रेगुलेशंस में क्या होने वाला है? व्हाट द गवर्नमेंट इज नाउ सेइंग इज दैट देयर विल बी एनहांस्ड टैक्स एग्जेम्पशंस ऑन सम ऑफ द काइंड ऑफ ट्रांजैक्शंस दैट कैन बी टेकन थ्रू, एंड बेसिकली फॉर नॉन रेजिडेंट इंडियंस एज वेल एंड सर्टन कैटेगरीज एज वेल, they will be exempt from any kind of taxes. That is the one thing. Next thing that comes out is that you're also talking about world class foreign universities and institutions to be allowed in the gift city, right? So one, obviously establishment and tie-ups, all of these things will also come into the picture, but there is going to be greater amount of information sharing, greater amount of knowledge sharing, and that is going to basically put India in the world map when it comes to international institutions, right? So you have international foreign centers basically at Singapore and London as well, and now you have one in Gujarat, but it still has to come to a level where a number of transactions has to be matching with what is happening through Singapore or London, right? So iske liye it's important that the IFSC becomes a lot more mature and has greater participation from global perspectives as well. So that is where this becomes important. Next thing is you're also talking about setting up an international arbitration center for the timely settlement of disputes under international jurisprudence. Iska thought process kya hai ki kuch, because all these transactions are going to be governed from a global perspective, it's important ki jo bhi aapke what do you say, any kind of disputes that are there, they need to be settled as fast as possible, because you cannot afford any delays, because this is a global platform from India, right? Because it's an international financial service center, it's important that it aligns with the great timelines that some of the other international financial service centers provide. So इस perspective में एक international arbitration center जरूरी है ताकि जितनी जल्दी हो सके उतनी जल्दी disputes settle हो पाएं. That is the whole thought process, right? So let's quickly move on to the next set of important announcements that came through in the budget. So the important thing that I'm talking about, now that we've talked about the PM Gati Shakti itself, and we're going to look at the road transport essentially now. So when I talk about the road transport here, the first thing that has come out is that the national highways network jo hai, it has to be expanded by another 25,000 kilometers, and that's going to happen in 2022-2023. Next thing that has come out is that another 20,000 crores have to be mobilized for the national highways network expansion. So 25,000 kilometer banane hain, and uske liye 20,000 crore ka funds have to be mobilized from that perspective. That is from the road transport angle. Next thing is when you look at multimodal logistics parks, right? So this is going to happen in the PPP mode, which is public-private partnership, right? So public-private partnership mode में contracts दिए जाएंगे, and this will be for the period 2022-2023, and this will be for majorly implementation at 4 locations, and that is where your multimodal logistics parks will come into the picture. Next thing, अब roads हो गया तो railways की बात करनी चाहिए. तो railways में क्या होगा? So there will basically be a one station, one product kind of a concept in order to help your local businesses and supply chain, and one station would try and enhance the productivity, efficiency from that particular product standpoint, and ensure that it is not only looking at the development but also looking at the distribution across the country. So इसमें basically क्या होगा, there will be more focus because each station will be concentrating on one particular product, and that will lead to better help towards businesses and the supply chains as well. The next thing that comes up is basically you're looking at another 2,000 kilometers railway network that will come under the Kavach program, which is basically the indigenous world-class technology and capacity augmentation that is going to be happening through Kavach, and उसमें 2,000 kilometer additionally आ जाएंगे अभी. Next thing that it talks about is basically the Vande Bharat trains. So there are going to be 400 new generation Vande Bharat trains that are going to be manufactured in the next 3 years. That's going to come up. Next thing is that again, apart from this as well, because PM Gati Shakti is a logistics angle from the railway standpoint also. So here it's going to be talking about 100 PM Gati Shakti cargo terminals, and these will be meant for multimodal logistics, and these also will be developed over the next 3 years, right? So basically railways mein one station, one product, then you're talking about 2,000 kilometers of more rails, then basically 400 new generation Vande Bharat trains, and then 100 PM Gati Shakti cargo terminals as well that will come for the multimodal logistics, right? So that is on railways. Now moving on to the next one. So basically Parvatmala, ye bhi important hai bhai, so ropeways bhi to chahiye. So roadways ho gaya, railways ho gaya, ropeways are also required. So your national ropeway development program Parvatmala is also going to be taken up under the PPP mode, which is public-private partnership. And here, basically, the contracts will be awarded for the period 2022-2023, and this will be for 8 ropeway projects of 60 kilometers. So that is on the Parvatmala. Next up, we're talking about a very important sector for the economy, which is your agriculture. इसमें क्या बोल रहे हैं कि basically 2.37 lakh crore rupees direct payments will basically be happening to 1.63 crore farmers for the procurement of wheat and paddy under Kharif and Rabi crops from that perspective. So direct payment to 1.63 crore farmers. So the next thing it talks about is also the chemical-free natural farming, right? So how do you promote chemical-free natural farming, especially in the context of those areas which are very, very close to the Ganga location, right? So here you're talking about the farmer lands within the 5 kilometers corridors around the Ganga. That has to be the key area because these chemicals already have a tendency to impact the rivers as well. So from that perspective, protection of the Ganga basin and to ensure that there are no chemicals coming through in pollution, That is where this particular angle comes into the picture. Next thing it also talks about is that the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, that is NABARD, will also look to facilitate a funding in the form of blended capital. When I say blended capital, it's going to be a combination of debt and equity, and a lot of other such parameters will come into the picture in order to finance the startups that are there for agri and your rural enterprise perspective, right? So unki special funding karne ke liye blended capital ko laya jayega. That is what is the next proposal there. And another very important angle is the Kisan drones, right? So you've seen drones. हमने Three Idiots में drones देखा था. So usage of those drones for your crop assessment, talking about digitization of the land records, कि कौन सा area किसके under आता है, right? All that becomes important. Spraying of the insecticides can also be used through drones. Obviously, it will massively reduce the effort the farmers are putting in right now, and of course, from a nutrient standpoint as well. So usage of Kisan drones is something which is going to be a game changer in this particular industry from the agri perspective, and that is again being recommended as part of the budget this year, right? So obviously, startups which are working towards drone development will definitely have a huge boost from that perspective, is what we get to understand. Ab kya benefits milenge, that will obviously be more granular as the year goes by. Now, next thing that we move in from agriculture to the next segment essentially, and that segment is the Ken Betwa project. Now, the question that comes in is, what is this Ken Betwa project, right? So obviously this is one of the first projects in the interlinking of rivers that we've been talking about, and it is basically under the NPP, which is your National Perspective Plan. So the idea is to connect Ken and Betwa rivers, which are both tributaries of the Yamuna, through a basically 221 kilometers long canal, and out of that 2 kilometers will actually be a long tunnel itself, right? So that is the perspective of the Ken Betwa project, where we're talking about the interlinkages of rivers here, right? And the water will basically flow from one to the other, and that is basically part of the National Perspective Plan. So the first thing that comes up here is the outlay itself. So there is a 1400 crore outlay that is there, and basically 9.08 lakh hectares of farmers' land will basically receive irrigation benefits because of that. And that's fantastic, right? Irrigation benefits because of the interlinkage of rivers is something which is phenomenal. It's going to add a lot of value to the farmers, right? Next thing we talk about is the MSMEs, and again a lot of initiatives from that perspective as well. So obviously some of the portals that have already been there for the MSMEs, so if you talk about the Udyam, eShram, NCS and Asim, all of these portals will now be interlinked with the data flowing from one to the other, so that it becomes easier for the MSMEs to operate. Next thing, you will also look at basically 130 lakh MSMEs being provided additional credit under the ECLGS, which is the Emergency Credit Linked Guarantee Scheme, and this scheme has now been further extended up to March 2023. So this was basically provided initially from the perspective of supporting MSMEs in the pandemic period, but it has been further extended till March 2023. एंड इसमें एलोकेशन की भी बात करते हैं. सो अभी तक जो गारंटी कवर था, द गारंटी कवर अंडर ECLGS, दैट वाज बेसिकली अप टू अ सर्टेन लेवल, एंड इट्स गोइंग टू बी एडिशनली एडेड टू अनदर 50,000 crores there, and the total cover now will be worth rupees 5 lakh crore that is being provided under the ECLGS. So that is the whole thought process here. Another thing is that when you talk specifically about the MSCs or your micro sector enterprises, उन लोग के लिए additional rupees 2 lakh crore in terms of credit will be provided under the CGT MSC. That is basically the Credit Guarantee Trust for your micro and small enterprises. So that is the additional for MSC specifically. That is another additional 2 lakh crore that is there. Now, next thing, it also talks about the RAMP program, which is the Raising and Accelerating the MSME Performance. And for this, there is an additional allocation of 6,000 crore that is going to be rolled out for that as well. Right. So once the MSMEs are done, let's try and move and talk about skill development, right? So when I talk about skill development, you're talking about a digital ecosystem being created for skilling and livelihood of the people, which allows you to basically either skill yourself, upskill yourself, or reskill yourself through various online training programs. And essentially it is basically going to be called as the Desh Stack e-portal, right? And that will be launched to empower the citizens. Next thing that it talks about is that the startups also will be promoted, those who are trying to facilitate DRaaS, right? Which is drone as a service. So we've heard of software as a service, and now we're looking at drone as a service, so that everyone does not have to manufacture or produce drones, but let's say there are startups which are providing drones, and those drones can be used for various kinds of initiatives and activities for upskilling as well, and a lot of other allied sectors also. So basically any startups who are working on the drones side will also be getting better facilities in order to promote DRAS, which is drones as a service. Right. So once skill development is discussed, education piche kaise reh sakta hai, we're going to talk about education as well. So the first thing that comes up is basically there was a one class, one TV channel program of the PM E-Vidya, and that is now going to be expanded to your 200 TV channels, right? So essentially there was 12 till now. हर एक क्लास के लिए एक टीवी चैनल, बट नाउ दैट्स गोइंग टू बी एक्सपेंडेड टू 200 टीवी channels. Next thing, you're also talking about virtual labs and skilling e-labs that will be set up for critical thinking development in students, and also providing a simulated learning environment to them. So virtual e-labs and skilling e-labs will also be provided. Next thing, you're also talking about high quality e-content which will be developed for delivery through your digital teachers, right? So again, ensuring that the education is reaching the grassroots levels, and this was one area which was found lacking from an inclusiveness standpoint in the last couple of years when the pandemic affected the country. Obviously, a lot of poor children who did not have access to digital facilities obviously bore the brunt of a lack of education for the last couple of years, right? So again, there is obviously a detailed UN report also which talks about what is the loss to the GDP of the world in the coming future just because of the students not being able to study properly over the last couple of years. Right, and that's a significantly huge number that is going to be a hit on the world GDP after some years, right? And that's a UN report that has actually highlighted this, which means there is definitely more scope for improving the access to digital education, not just in India, but globally as well. But these are some initiatives from an Indian standpoint which will definitely help. So the next thing that is being discussed here is basically the digital university for basically providing a world-class quality universal education with personalized learning experience. So this is again something which is going to get becoming very, very important. So that is the education angle in the budget. Now moving on to the next segment here, we are basically looking at health. Again, a very, very crucial sector considering what has happened in the last couple of years. So the first thing is we are basically talking about an open platform for basically your national digital health ecosystem, wherein obviously your records with regards to a patient level information will obviously be available on this digital health ecosystem, right? And any kind of medical history is there, all of that will be available. Next thing is you're also talking about a national tele mental health program. Obviously, mental health has been a critical issue over the last couple of years, especially in this pandemic situation. So basically looking at mental health counseling and care services. Next thing it talks about is also the fact that when you're talking about telemental health, what exactly are you doing? You're basically talking about a network of 23 telemental health centers of excellence that will be set up, and here you'll have NIMHANS being the nodal center for that, and IIIT Bangalore basically providing the tech support towards that as well. So that is on the telemental health perspective. Now, moving on to the next aspect, which is your Saksham Anganwadi. So Anganwadi essentially are the entities which are dealing with any kind of development related towards your children and women. Many of the schemes that are there towards, let's say, women-centric issues, or let's say your children as well, all of these are basically handled by Anganwadi as the primary implementation agency. So when I look at this, what are the key developments from a budget perspective here? So it says that you're looking at integrated benefits to women and children through various programs. Now, when I look at the budget allocations for 2022-2023, so you are basically looking at Mission Shakti, which basically has an allocation of 3184 crore rupees. Then you have your Mission Vatsalya, which has an allocation of 1472 crore rupees. Then you have Saksham Anganwadi, which is, let's say, a version 2.0 of Anganwadi, usse ek kadam aage, right? So it is Saksham Anganwadi, and then again development on PM Poshan is Poshan 2.0. So the combined allocation for Saksham Anganwadi and Poshan 2.0 in the budget estimates for 2022-2023 is basically looking at 20,263 crore rupees. So this is an integrated benefits to children and women, and this is the holistic allocation that has been made in the budget for some of these initiatives, right? And now the budget also talked about a very important aspect of the upgradation of the Anganwadis from calling primarily Anganwadis to Saksham Anganwadis, right? So upgradation of those Anganwadis, and the government is saying that it is going to look to target 2 lakh such Anganwadis and upgrade them, right? That is on the Saksham Anganwadis bit. Now next thing is water, very crucial resource. So we are talking about the Har Ghar Nal Se Jal, that is the program. So 60,000 crore rupees allocated towards 3.8 crore households in 2022-2023. The perspective is very simple: Har Ghar Nal Se Jal. मतलब tap water आना चाहिए. That is the whole context. The next program is basically again a very important one from the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana perspective, which is the housing for all. So here we're talking about an allocation of 48,000 crore rupees for the completion of 80 lakh houses in the 2022-2023 period under the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. So this will ensure housing for all. Now moving on to the next segment, you're also talking about e-passports, and this is going to be very interesting because we're saying that these are going to be embedded with chips and futuristic technology that's going to be ruled out, so it will become easier for the citizens to basically travel abroad, and a lot of things will be digitized. So that is something which is definitely very interesting, what it looks like at this point in time. Then you look at the next element, which is the urban planning. A lot of initiatives from the urban planning perspective as well. अब यहाँ पे देखते हैं क्या क्या हो रहा है. First thing is you're talking about the modernization of building bylaws, right? So bringing more efficiency there. Talking about modernization of your town planning systems and your transit-oriented development as well in terms of ensuring the movements and logistics as well. How are things going to develop? So all this is under the urban planning modernization scheme. Now next thing it talks about is battery swapping policy. This is for your electric vehicles, right? So basically setting up of charging stations at scale in your urban areas, and you're also talking about not necessarily charging itself but also swapping the batteries, right? So essentially all the manufacturers of let's say batteries from an electric vehicle standpoint and others as well, the other original equipment manufacturers, all these will also get benefited from this. The thought process is very simple, that one, charging station is a good solution, or at least give the facility of swapping batteries so that you don't have to keep charging again and again by yourself, but you can also look at charging through the swapping of batteries itself, right? So a battery change karte hue, technically that also provides you the benefit from that standpoint, right? Next thing it talks about is basically talking about the unique land parcel identification. Right, so land records need to be updated, and basically every land parcel will have a unique identification number, and basically for the IT based management of the land records that are there from an entire country perspective. Next thing it basically talks about is also talking about the expanding the scope of the Parivesh portal, right? So which is basically looking at environment, forest and climate change, and this basically falls under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, right? So how do you going to look at the expansion of the scope of the Parivesh portal? This again falls under the purview of the urban planning, right? Now the next segment that the budget basically talks about is another very important aspect, which is the C-PACE. अब इसमें क्या होने वाला है? You're talking about the Center for Processing Accelerated Corporate Exit. So अगर मान लीजिए कोई corporate अगर insolvent हो जाता है, right? So how do you ensure a speedy winding up of the companies, right? So you already have the IBC, SARFAESI Act, all those things are already there, but this Center for Processing Accelerated Corporate Exits will ensure that winding up of companies will be at a much faster pace. Right, and essentially it's called C-PACE for that reason only, right? Now moving on to the next element, we're also talking about massive developments from the perspective of AVGC, and you'll basically set up a promotion task force to develop AVGCs in India. Now, what is AVGC? Obviously, you're talking about animation, visual effects, gaming, and comics, right? This is again a massive development. Now, especially gaming and comics is something which is very relevant for the youngsters, and comics especially for the kids, right? So a lot of learning can happen through that. When you talk about education today, also a lot of it is driven by visual effects and animation. So it's there in the entertainment industry, it's there in the education industry, and obviously this is a massive sector which definitely deserves promotion, because unless you promote this, it will not reach at the grassroots level, right? So basically you're talking about a task force that is going to be set up for the AVGCs as well. Now moving on to the next segment, again telecom, very very important. So basically you're talking about design-led manufacturing scheme in order to build a strong 5G ecosystem, and this is going to be a part of the PLI or the productivity linked incentive scheme, right? So this is for the telecom department or the telecom sector, so to speak, from a 5G ecosystem perspective. So next up, we're basically talking about export promotion as an angle, right? So we're talking about the SEZ Act or the Special Economic Zone Act that is there, and you're saying that it's going to be replaced by a new legislation, and which will basically eliminate this isolation that has been there in the SEZ so far, and it will allow states to be more proactively participating in this process, and it will enable the states to become partners in what is known as the development of enterprise and service hubs. Now, apart from this, the customs administration of your special economic zones is also to be fully IT driven and function on the Customs National Portal, and this shall be implemented by the 30th of September 2022. So now, having addressed the export promotion angle, let's basically talk about the defense, right? So we're talking about Atmanirbharta in defense, right? So we're basically talking about self-reliance in defense. So here you're saying that 68% of the capital procurement budget for the domestic industry is going to be there. between 2022-2023, and that is basically up from 58% that was there last year. So the context is that जो हमारा procurement है from a domestic standpoint, right, self-reliance perspective, that percentage has actually been increased. Second thing, it also says that the defense research and development is going to be opened for the industry, startups, academia as well, and 25% of the defense R&D budget is going to be allocated towards this, right? So that is the whole context. So the way we saw regulatory sandboxes in RBI and some of the other regulatory bodies, there is quite a possibility of seeing regulatory sandboxes from a defense R&D perspective as well, right? Now, next thing it talks about is also setting up an independent nodal umbrella body that will be for meeting testing and the certification requirements, right? That is where I talked about the fact that you're looking at a sandbox kind of an experience in defense R&D also. Now, moving on to the next segment, which is basically the energy transition and climate actions, right? So we're talking about the net zero emissions and the agreement of the Conference of Parties, or COP26 as it is called, and several countries have basically come up with their NDCs, or your nationally determined contributions, and similarly India has also come up with its own targets, right? So Modi ji has referred to a lot of targets that are there from a net zero by 2050. That's the target that we've been talking about. So from that perspective, a lot of the initiatives in this particular angle become very important. Now let's try and discuss them as well. So firstly, there is going to be an additional allocation of 19,500 crore for the PLI schemes for your manufacture of high efficiency solar modules, and this is in order to meet the goal of 280 gigawatts of installed solar power by 2030. तो उसके लिए एडिशनल एलोकेशन है ताकि 280 गीगावाट्स ऑफ इंस्टॉल्ड सोलर पावर जो है वो 2030 तक हो पाए, तो उसके लिए 19,500 crores एडिशनल एलोकेशन. नेक्स्ट यूर टॉकिंग अबाउट 5 to 7% ऑफ बायोमास पेलेट्स they are going to be co-fired in your thermal power plants. अब इससे क्या होगा? First, it will result in the carbon dioxide savings of approximately 38 million metric tons annually. The extra income will also be there to the farmers and ensure that it will lead to job opportunities for the locals as well. And it will also help avoid stubble burning that happens in your agricultural fields, right? So that is the whole thought process as far as this 5 to 7% biomass pellets is concerned. Next thing, it also says that there will be 4 pilot projects that will be set up for your coal gasification and conversion of coal into chemicals specifically for that purpose, right? And next, you're talking about the financial support to your farmers belonging to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, especially the ones who are interested in taking up agroforestry as well, right? So unko special what do you say provisions diye jayenge in order to focus on agroforestry. So these are some of the key initiatives from the energy transition and climate action perspective. Next up, looking at some other important elements. So the first thing is basically talking about the public and capital investment. So ab isme kya ho raha hai? Let's try and talk about it. So first thing, the outlay for the capital expenditure has obviously been significantly increased by 35.4%, and we're looking at rupees 7.5 lakh crore in the 2022-2023 period, which is basically 2.9% of the GDP, and it was basically 5.5 lakh crore that was there in the current year. So उसमें से बढ़ा के 35.4% बढ़ा के we are going to a 7.5 lakh crore level. Next thing it says is that when you talk about the effective capital expenditure of the government of India, that is basically estimated at rupees 10.68 lakh crores, and that is 4.1% of GDP in 2022-2023, right? So basically when you talk about capital expenditure and then effective capital expenditure, there are some additional terms that get added to this cost, and that is basically estimated at 4.1% of the GDP. Right. So now that we've discussed public capital investment, it becomes important to understand this term, which was also brought about by our current Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. Nageshwaran, yesterday, wherein he talked about providing greater fiscal space to the states. ऐसा क्या करने वाले हैं हम? हमारे पास ज़्यादा fiscal space क्यों है? Firstly, you're providing an enhanced outlay for the scheme for financial assistance to the states for your capital investment. So that is the first thing. There's going to be an enhanced outlay for this. Second, from 10,000 crore that has been there in the budget estimates to 15,000 crores in the revised estimates for the current year. So budget estimates last year के budget estimates 10,000 के थे, but हमने revised estimates देखा. When we saw the revised estimates for the current year, we realized that 15,000 crore was there instead of 10,000. So additionally 5,000 crore enhanced outlay was there. That is the whole thought process. Next thing, you're also talking about an allocation of rupees 1 lakh crore in the 2022-2023 period in order to assist the states in catalyzing the overall investments that are there from an economic standpoint. And you're also looking at at providing a 50-year interest-free loans, and this is over and above the normal borrowings that are allowed, right? So apart from the normal borrowings, you're also going to be given a 50-year interest-free loan, and the allocation towards that is rupees 1 lakh crore for the period 2022-2023, and the idea is to catalyze overall investments in the economy for that particular state. Now, technically, the other angle is to look at the GSDP, which is the gross state domestic product. So, when you look at from that perspective, for the period 2022-2023, the states will basically be allowed a fiscal deficit of around 4% of the GSDP, and that is basically 0.5% being tied to the power sector reforms, which means 0.5% have to be allocated towards power sector reforms, and basically you have an overall window of 4% jitna aapko allowed hai for the state domestic product or the gross state domestic product mein, right? So, fiscal deficit for each state can be 4% of the GSDP. That is the allocation that has been allowed by the center. Now, moving further, you're also looking at the fiscal management. What is the scenario right now? Let's try and understand some of the actual expenditure that is being discussed all this while. While we looked at the pie chart in the first couple of slides, let's try and look at the detailed numbers now. So first thing, the budget estimates for 2021-2022 were basically at rupees 34.83 lakh crore. वो budget estimate था last year when we actually calculated the revised estimate, which means कितना actual खर्चा हुआ, right? When you look at the revised estimates for 2021-2022, that is basically at 37.7 lakh crore rupees. The question comes कि why are we still calling it revised estimates? Estimate because ये already अभी भी 2 महीना बाकी है ना भाई, we are still on 1st of February, there's still a couple of months to go, so you have to look at it from the perspective of the next 2 months का projection also. So from that perspective, when you look at it, 34.83 was the estimate last year, and we have only gone till 37.7, which is a fairly reasonable number overall as far as the revised estimates are concerned. Now, moving on further, when you look at the total expenditure in 2022-2023, that is going to be estimated at rupees 39.45 lakh crore. Right. Now, when you look at this number, the total receipts other than the borrowings in 2022-2023, that is basically estimated at 22.84 lakh crore. बिना borrowings के इतने receipts हैं, ठीक है, and expenditure इतना है. Right. So we're basically saying that the fiscal deficit in the current year is basically 6.9% of the GDP as against the 6.8% that was there in the budget estimates. Right. When I look at the fiscal deficit for the future year, that is 2022-2023, that is basically estimated at 6.4% of the GDP. Right. So when I look at this number, it gives me a satisfaction that चलो भाई पिछले साल का जो फिस्कल डेफिसिट था उससे तो कम हो रहा है ना. सो वी आर एट 6.8 as per the budget estimates, but as per the revised estimates we are at 6.9% of the GDP in terms of fiscal deficit in the current year, that is 2021-2022, and the fiscal deficit that is estimated for the next financial year, that is 2022-2023, that is basically 6.4% of the GDP. And as I said, even though it is above 6%, it is still okay because we are still recovering from the pandemic. So खर्चे करना बहुत जरूरी है इस वक्त, right? That is very important from the economic perspective. Next thing it talks about is when you look at the direct taxes. Obviously, the only thing that has changed from a layman or the common man's perspective is the updated returns, which can be filed within 2 years from the end of the actual relevant assessment year. That is one benefit that is coming out. Then the last point I'm talking about is also the fact that you're looking at mobilizing funds or resources for your green infrastructure, and that can happen through your sovereign green bonds, right? And that can be issued in order to mobilize resources from that perspective. Bonds जो हैं, they are basically debt instruments जिसके थ्रू आप फंडिंग ऑब्टेन कर सकते हो. ऑब्वियसली डेट इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स का मतलब है कि यू आर बोरोइंग, सो ऑब्वियसली जिससे भी आप बोरो कर रहे हो उनको आपको इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट्स देने होंगे. दैट विल बी इन द फॉर्म ऑफ कूपन्स, right? So obviously I'm not going to get into details of debt instruments right now, but sovereign gold bonds are basically debt instruments which will be focused on the green infrastructure and mobilizing resources and investments for that, right? That is the perspective that comes out through sovereign gold bonds, right? So this is in a nutshell what I wanted to discuss with you guys in terms of the overall scheme of things as far as the current budget announcements are concerned for the financial year 2022-2023. Right, so that's a wrap on today's session in terms of what we wanted to discuss as the key highlights for the Union Budget 2022-2023. Of course, a lot of interesting elements came out in the budget, and a lot of progressive things from a long-term perspective, right? And that is what I want you to leave with from this particular session. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Until then, this is Ravi signing off. Have a great day and a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. See you guys.